For 24 long years, Judge Eleanor Davis ruled the courthouse with an unyielding hand, dismantling careers and lives in her wake. But everything changed when one attorney flipped the script, ultimately seeing the woman in power arrested right in the very courtroom she had once dominated with an iron grip. Inside the Franklin County Courthouse in Atlanta, Georgia, the air was thick with tension, not because of the heat that scorched the streets outside, but something far darker. It was as if the very walls of the building had absorbed the weight of years of secrets, and anyone who stepped through the creaking doors immediately sensed the chilling truth of what lay within Judge Davis' domain. Judge Davis was a figure of few words. Her eyes barely ever left the files before her, but when they did, they cut through the room like a sharp blade. Her voice, always calm and controlled, carried the heavy weight of authority, capable of breaking even the most assured attorneys. For more than 2 decades, she held the gavel, building a reputation that wasn't recorded in the law books or discussed in legal circles, but rather whispered in hushed tones. Those who had spent years in the bar, especially minority lawyers, knew what awaited them when they entered her courtroom. It was an unspoken truth: the decisions always seemed to sway in a particular direction, and the rulings, no matter how small, followed a predictable rhythm. Though no one had ever been able to prove it, everyone was certain of it. And today, that unspoken power dynamic was about to face its greatest challenge. As Marcus Thornton walked into the courtroom, his polished leather shoes echoed against the cold marble floors. He had been in these halls before, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't just another defense lawyer facing off against Judge Eleanor Davis. He wasn't just another name on the docket. Today, he carried something that would change the course of the proceedings. At 48 years old, Marcus had built a reputation on tackling the toughest cases, the ones no one else dared touch. His name had spread far beyond Georgia, known for his unparalleled skill in dismantling the prosecution's case. That made him a target for judges like Davis, but that had never been a deterrent. What made him pause, just for a fleeting moment, was the look in her eyes as he made his way to the defense table. She hated him, not because of the case at hand, not because of anything he had said or done. She despised him simply because of who he was. His very presence irritated her. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about his client, Jerome Patterson, a man falsely accused of armed robbery. It wasn't merely about clearing his name. This was about something much deeper, something much more important. And he wasn't going to leave this courtroom without making that abundantly clear. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Davis said, her eyes barely lifting from the case files before her, "you've been walking a fine line in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." There was no reason for her to say that. They hadn't even begun. Marcus tightened his grip on his briefcase, his face betraying nothing. "I'll make sure not to, Your Honor." Judge Davis gave a condescending smile, her voice dripping with disdain. "Good, because I've got a packed schedule and I don't have time for theatrics." She turned her attention to the prosecution, a young, eager assistant district attorney named Rachel Turner, fresh out of law school and eager to make her mark. She looked like she was trying a little too hard to impress all the wrong people. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Turner said, casting a smug glance in Marcus's direction. Of course they were ready. They always were when the case was tilted against a black man. Marcus's client sat beside him, hands clasped tightly together, shoulders hunched as if the weight of a lifetime had already been placed on them. Jerome Patterson had been through the system too many times. Seen too much, endured too much, lost too much. Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice steady, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're ready to," he said, letting the words ring throughout the courtroom. Judge Davis let out an exasperated breath through her nose. "Let's get this over with." The trial began, but to Marcus, it felt less like a trial and more like a performance. And Judge Davis was playing the leading role. Every objection Marcus raised was dismissed with barely a glance. Each time Assistant District Attorney Turner fumbled over a legal argument, Judge Davis was quick to step in, guiding her with a gentle hand as though correcting a pupil in a classroom. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed. But no one dared to speak up, except Marcus. He watched her closely, the way her lips curled in subtle disdain when he spoke, the way her eyes narrowed with barely veiled contempt. It wasn't just bias. No, it was something far darker, something Marcus had been preparing for, quietly, over the years. But no one in that room knew that yet. Marcus had been in hostile courtrooms before, but this was something entirely different. Judge Davis wasn't even trying to conceal it. Every time Marcus spoke, she cut him off with surgical precision. Every time he presented a solid argument, she brushed it aside as though it were nothing more than a nuisance, a fly buzzing at her ear. The courtroom had a rhythm of its own. Lawyers would speak, judges would rule, the jury would listen. But in this courtroom, Judge Davis had already made up her mind. The verdict had been decided long before any of the testimony had been heard. Marcus could see the discomfort in the jury's eyes. He saw it in the way they shifted in their seats. Even some of the white jurors who may have come in with their own biases couldn't ignore what was happening in front of them. But Judge Davis didn't care. She only doubled down. Her tone grew harsher with each exchange. "Mr. Thornton, you're testing my patience. Mr. Thornton, if you raise one more frivolous objection, I'll have you removed from this courtroom. Mr. Thornton, this is not your personal stage. If you want to perform, do it somewhere else." Marcus kept his face neutral, calm, but inside, his blood was boiling. Not because she was insulting him, he had learned to deal with that long ago, but because she had made it personal, and that was a mistake. Still, Marcus knew he needed her to keep talking, to keep revealing who she really was under the mask of authority. "Your Honor," he said, his voice even, controlled. "The prosecution just introduced evidence that was never disclosed during discovery. This is a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland. I move for an immediate mistrial." Judge Davis leaned back in her chair, adjusting her glasses with exaggerated indifference. "Denied." Marcus blinked, but not from surprise, from strategy. He let the silence settle for a moment, letting the weight of his words linger in the room before he spoke again. "Just to be clear, Your Honor," he continued, "you're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation?" Davis's lips pressed together tightly, her patience thinning. "I said denied, Mr. Thornton." Marcus felt the shift in the courtroom. The reporters, their pens moving faster. The gallery's whispers growing more intense. She noticed it too. Her gaze darkened, and for the first time, she met his eyes directly. "You are dangerously close to being held in contempt, Mr. Thornton." Marcus tilted his head slightly, the calm in his voice almost mocking. "For what, Your Honor?" "Asking the court to follow the law." Judge Davis slammed her gavel so forcefully that the sound reverberated through the high ceilings. "That's enough," she barked. "One more word, and I'll have you removed." The room fell silent. Marcus could feel his heartbeat, steady, come like a drum in the quiet. But he wasn't nervous. This was exactly what he needed. Jerome, sitting beside him, clenched his fists under the table. "Man, don't let her do this to you," he muttered, barely audible. Marcus didn't even spare him a glance. "I have nothing further, Your Honor," he said smoothly, taking his seat. Judge Davis scoffed, a smug expression crossing her face as if she had somehow won. But what she didn't realize, the game was just beginning, and she had just played right into his hands. Marcus sat motionless, his expression a mask of calm. He knew the art of knowing when to push and when to pull back just enough to let someone expose their own flaws. And Judge Davis, she was doing exactly that. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, some of them stealing quick looks at the gallery where reporters furiously scribbled in their notepads. It was undeniable now. The shift, the discomfort, the murmurs. The unmasking of a judge who had grown far too comfortable in her own power. But Judge Davis wasn't backing down. If anything, she straightened up even more in her chair, her voice becoming colder, sharper. "Ms. Turner, continue with your questioning." Rachel Turner cleared her throat, visibly rattled. She was young, but not naive. She saw what was happening, too. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned toward the witness stand, where a frail, nervous store clerk sat. The man's eyes darted around, his hands trembling. "Mr. Thomas, can you confirm that the defendant, Jerome Patterson, was the man you saw at the scene of the robbery?" The elderly man hesitated. Marcus leaned forward slightly, studying the witness. He knew that kind of hesitation. It was the kind that signaled uncertainty. The kind that came when someone wasn't as sure as they'd been coached to be. But Judge Davis wasn't interested in hesitation. "Answer the question," she snapped. The witness flinched and cleared his throat. "I think so," he muttered. Marcus was on his feet in an instant. "Objection, Your Honor. That is not a definitive statement." Without missing a beat, Judge Davis's voice cut through the air, overruled. Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head just enough for the jury to see. The subtle gesture was intentional. He wanted them to feel the weight of what was happening. He let Turner fumble through a few more questions before standing up again for the cross-examination. Marcus approached the witness stand, his voice smooth and controlled. "Mr. Thomas, you said you think you saw my client that night. How certain are you?" The witness licked his lips nervously, eyes flickering between the attorneys and the jury. I thought I saw him, but you're not certain." Before the witness could continue, Judge Davis interrupted sharply. "Move on, Mr. Thornton." Marcus turned slowly, locking eyes with the judge. This was too blatant, too obvious. "I'd like the witness to answer, Your Honor." Her face tightened, her patience visibly wearing thin. "I said move on." Marcus didn't blink. He didn't even flinch. He wasn't done yet. And neither was the truth. "For the record, Your Honor," Marcus said calmly, his gaze unwavering, "you are preventing the witness from clarifying his own statement." Judge Davis's face twitched, her eyes narrowing as if daring him to continue. "I'm warning you, Mr. Thornton." Marcus smiled, just a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "I understand, Your Honor." He turned back toward the witness, no further questions. With a deliberate, slow stride, he walked back to the defense table. The tension in the room shifted, palpable, twisting, tightening. The atmosphere was electric charged with something heavy, something inevitable. Judge Davis knew. She knew she had lost control of the room. And Marcus knew it was time, because he wasn't here merely to win this case. He was here to end her. Reaching into his briefcase, his fingers brushed the edge of a stack of documents that would change everything. His heartbeat was steady, but his mind raced with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. And just as he grasped them, the courtroom doors swung open with a sharp bang. The sound alone was enough to pull every eye away from the witness stand. Two federal agents in dark suits walked in, their steps precise, their presence commanding. Every movement exuded authority. The room went still. A silence so deep, it seemed to swallow the very air. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply straightened his tie and folded his hands neatly on the defense table, keeping his focus steady, calm, and purposeful. Judge Davis's eyes flickered between confusion and irritation. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. One of the agents, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, flashed a badge before speaking. "Judge Eleanor Davis, we need to speak with you immediately." Her jaw tightened. "I am in the middle of a trial." The agent remained unfazed. "It's urgent." Marcus could see it now, the flicker of confusion in her eyes, swiftly masked by the arrogance she wore like armor. But it wasn't enough to hide the brief spark of fear. She squared her shoulders, trying to regain some semblance of control. "This is highly inappropriate. Whatever this is, it will have to wait until I've concluded these proceedings." The second agent stepped forward. His gaze swept across the courtroom before he spoke, his voice clear and firm, addressing everyone present. "This is a matter of federal interest. It cannot wait." A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery, filling the courtroom with an undercurrent of confusion and intrigue. Even the jury, sworn to impartiality, couldn't hide their curiosity. Their eyes shifted, drawn toward the agents in dark suits, each of them trying to make sense of what was unfolding. Philip Turner, The young prosecutor cleared his throat awkwardly. Should we take a recess, Your Honor? Judge Davis's fingers curled tightly around the bench, her knuckles white. No. Her voice was sharp to sharp. We are not taking a recess. The defense has already wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to allow. The first agent stepped forward, his voice steady and unwavering. We have a warrant for your arrest. A collective gasp rippled through the room. For the first time in 24 years. Judge Davis lost control of her courtroom. Marcus let the moment breathe, allowing the gravity of what had just transpired to sink into every corner of the room. He stood slowly, deliberately, his every movement precise. He looked around at the jury, at the gallery, at the reporters who were scribbling frantically. And then, finally, he turned his attention to the woman who had been in charge of this courtroom for far too long. And he spoke. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady, measured. I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial. He let those words hang in the air for a moment before continuing, his gaze unwavering. But it seems this trial is now the least of your concerns. Judge Davis's face drained of color, as if the life had been sucked out of her in an instant. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his jacket. The room fell into an almost unnatural silence as he read aloud. Meredith Davis, you are being arrested under suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under federal law. The room erupted. The gallery exploded in voices, some shocked, some delighted, and some stunned into a silence that was louder than any words. The jury sat frozen, their eyes bouncing between Marcus and the woman at the bench, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Judge Davis looked from the agents to the paper in the agent's hand, then back to Marcus. And for the first time she truly saw him, not just another attorney standing before her, trying to argue a case. No, he was the man who had been waiting for this moment. The one who had been biding his time, building this very case against her. Mr. Thornton, her voice was no longer sharp. It was unsteady, filled with disbelief. Marcus took a slow step forward, his briefcase still in his hand. He locked eyes with her, unwavering, calm in the face of it all. I told you, he said, his voice steady and resolute, I follow the law. Even when the law fails people like me. The lead agent moved toward the bench, his voice unwavering. Judge, we need you to stand. She didn't move. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy, as everyone waited watching. Then, finally, slowly, Judge Davis stood. The sound of the handcuffs snapping around her wrists was sharp final. It echoed through the courtroom, a sound that would linger in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it. For 24 years, Judge Eleanor Davis had ruled this courtroom with an iron grip. Attorneys had feared her. Defendants had known they didn't stand a chance. The system had protected her for decades, turning a blind eye to her biased rulings, her contemptuous behavior, her indifference to justice for people like Marcus Thornton. But now, she stood in the very place where she had condemned countless men before. Her wrists bound, her eyes frantic, darting as she struggled to maintain control. Her power slipping, unraveling in front of her very eyes. The courtroom was electric, a rare, once-in-a-lifetime moment that no one had expected to witness. The tension was thick, charged with a sense of justice finally catching up with a woman who had spent years avoiding it. The jury, frozen in shock, the gallery, holding their collective breath. Even Philip Turner, the young prosecutor who had once been so eager to please her, was staring, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. No one moved. No one dared speak. Marcus let the moment stretch, feeling the weight of it in the silence. He had spent years building to this, collecting every shred of evidence, every piece of information, tracking every bribe, every unethical ruling, every case she had twisted. He had been patient, working the long game, knowing that one day the weight of her corruption would become too heavy to ignore, and today was that day. One of the federal agents pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and began reading the charges aloud, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Meredith Davis, You are under arrest for multiple violations of the Civil Rights Act: bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Judge Davis's voice cracked as she finally found her words. "This is outrageous," she hissed, her face twisted with disbelief and fury. The lead agent didn't flinch. He didn't blink. "You can take that up with your lawyer," he said flatly. And with that, the courtroom was no longer just a place of law and order. It was the stage for a reckoning. A moment that would go down in history not as another case, but as the fall of a judge who had once believed herself untouchable. A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. The reporters scrambled to capture every detail: the way Judge Davis's hands trembled, the way her once imposing presence now seemed so small, so fragile in the face of it all. She turned her eyes to Marcus, and for the first time, he saw the full extent of her fury. "You," she spat the word like venom, her voice a dangerous mix of rage and disbelief. "This is your doing." Marcus lifted his chin slightly, his expression cool and steady. "This is justice," he corrected, his voice calm, unwavering. For the first time in his career, the balance had shifted. Judge Davis tried to pull herself together, but it was no use. The power she had held for so long was slipping away, evaporating into the air. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. For years, she had sat in judgment, handing down hollow lectures about accountability, respect for the law. And now she stood before the very system she had abused. The agents moved her toward the doors, but not before one final humiliation. A court officer, someone who had worked under her for years, someone who had once bowed to her authority, without question held the door open for her. Like she was just another defendant, Judge Davis hesitated, looking back one final time, her expression a mixture of disbelief and rage. Then, with a sharp breath, she stepped through the door. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, and just like that, she was gone. The courtroom was left in stunned silence. The weight of what had just transpired settled over everyone. It was the kind of moment that made time feel like it had stopped. Marcus exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the defense table, his mind still racing. He didn't move. He didn't speak immediately. Tyrone Wilkes, his client, turned to him, his face a mixture of shock and awe. "Man," Tyrone muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. "I thought people like her never paid for what they did." Marcus glanced at the now empty judge's bench. For a moment, he let the silence stretch before he answered. "They do," he said eventually. "They just have to be held accountable." But the real lesson he knew was still to come. The courtroom had never felt so alive. The gallery, still in shock, erupted into hushed conversations. Some whispered in disbelief, others in barely contained satisfaction. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable, but the sense that they had all witnessed something extraordinary hung thick in the air. Marcus remained still, his gaze unwavering. He had fought battles in court before. But this was different. This was bigger. He had played the long game, knowing that Judge Davis's corruption was too deep, too bold, too reckless to remain hidden forever. He had watched, he had waited, and when the moment arrived, he took his shot. And now, after years of patience, of gathering evidence, of waiting for her to make one final mistake, justice had finally arrived. But Tyrone Wilkes was still in handcuffs. Judge Davis was gone, but the trial she had carefully stacked against him was far from finished. Marcus turned, his gaze locking with Philip Turner, the young prosecutor who had once walked with such arrogance, so sure of his place under Judge Davis's protection. Now, Marcus saw the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty. He stood tall, and with a measured voice, he spoke. "You wanted to play with the system," Marcus said. "Now it's your turn to face it." The courtroom was still. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the full force of his conviction. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the pieces had been set into motion. And nothing was ever going to be the same again, not anymore. Now, Philip Turner, the young prosecutor, was pale, his hands gripping the edges of his notes like a drowning man clinging to a life raft. The security he had once felt under Judge Davis's rule had evaporated in an instant. He had just lost his safety net. Marcus cleared his throat, cutting through the tension. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm as he addressed the replacement judge. The man, an older black judge with graying hair and a reputation for fairness, had been rushed in from another courtroom to take over the proceedings. "Given the recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." The new judge folded his hands together, his eyes calm, but sharp. "On what grounds, Mr. Thornton?" Marcus turned slowly to face the jury, his voice steady. "On the grounds that this entire trial was poisoned from the start." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of his statement settle. "Judge Davis's arrest proves what we've known all along: she was never impartial, and neither were her rulings. This case was manipulated, evidence was ignored, and my client was never given a fair trial." Marcus turned back to the judge, his gaze unwavering. "And now that the woman who orchestrated this injustice is in handcuffs, the only thing left to do is undo the damage she caused." The new judge leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on Marcus. He studied him with the kind of measured patience that only years of experience could bring. Then, slowly, his lips parted. "I agree." A heavy silence filled the courtroom, the kind of pause that made everything feel suspended in time. "Then the charges against Tyrone Wilkes are dismissed," the judge declared. "Bailiff, remove his restraints." For a moment, no one moved. It felt like the room was holding its breath, suspended in that one moment of justice being served. Then, Tyrone let out a long breath, a breath he had been holding for years, one that he hadn't even realized he had been holding. The courtroom officer approached slowly and unlocked the handcuffs, and for the first time in a long time Tyrone's hands were his own again. He flexed his fingers, feeling the freedom he hadn't tasted in years. The room was still, but it was alive now, pulsing with the energy of a victory that no one had dared to imagine. Marcus stood tall, his eyes moving over the room, taking in the quiet awe of the jury, the whispers in the gallery, and the stunned silence of the courtroom. The battle wasn't over, but Tyrone Wilkes was free, and in that moment, that was enough. The moment hung thick in the air, so heavy with emotion that even Philip Turner didn't dare object. He sat there, hands trembling slightly on the desk, staring into space as if he had lost something far bigger than just a trial. Tyrone rubbed his wrists, the marks of years of restraint still fresh on his skin. Then he turned to Marcus, his voice soft, almost disbelieving. "I don't even know what to say." Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder, his grip steady, reassuring. "You don't have to say anything, because today, the justice system had actually worked. Not because it was built that way, but because someone had fought to make it happen." Tyrone stood slowly, looking around the courtroom that had nearly swallowed him whole, his eyes scanning the room one last time. Then, without another word, he walked toward the exit. Marcus followed him, his thoughts heavy as the weight of what had just transpired pressed down on his chest. He walked silently behind Tyrone, feeling the echo of every step. Because this wasn't just about Tyrone. This was about every case Judge Davis had ever ruled on. Every innocent man she had sentenced unjustly. Every bribe she had taken. Every biased judgment she had handed down. Today was just the beginning. Marcus had won today, but tomorrow, he had work to do. Because there were more Langfords out there. More corrupt, broken systems to expose, and Marcus wasn't done yet. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, then turned back to the audience, his eyes steady, his voice strong. "If you believe in real justice, if you believe in holding power accountable, don't just watch." He let the words linger in the room for a moment. "Make your voice heard." Then, with a purposeful nod, he added, "Like, comment, subscribe." And with that, they both walked out. The door closing softly behind them, as the weight of everything they had just fought for finally settled.